Hey, lovely listeners, and welcome back to Crime Analyst in the Intelligence Cell. And today I'm delighted to be joined by a returning guest. Robert, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Rand. I am the author of the book, The Menendez Murders, that was originally released in September 2018. The book was re-released a year ago, 1 week before the Monsters Menendez story came out on Netflix. And actually, I was also interviewed in the Menendez documentary that came out on Netflix in October of 24. But the reason that Erik and Lyle Menendez are back in court is because of a documentary I created and executive produced in May of 2023 titled Menendez plus Menudo, Boys Betrayed, which is streaming on Peacock. And it's now been licensed in 50 different countries. And the most recent one was in Brazil. The documentary began airing August 20th, 1989, which is the 36-year anniversary of the killing of Jose and Kitty Menendez. And just one last plug. This is the Brazilian edition. I have 15 foreign editions of the Menendez Murders, which of course is the mothership is available in English, but I'm on the bestseller list in Brazil and Japan. Brazil and France. And, people all over the world are interested in this case, not just in the States.
Well, that's just all incredible, Robert, and congratulations on your book charting. And so it should too, because it really is the story that's factually driven in terms of that compendium, which really lays out the case from beginning. I can't even say to end, because here we still are talking about Erik and Lyle Menendez following the parole board hearings.
It is the never-ending story, and the headline that I want to get out today, the brand new headline is, I know many of the supporters are unhappy, they're sad that the brothers were denied parole. However, statistically, most people that go before the parole board in California for the first time are not granted parole, are not recommended for parole. They're not, it's the technical term is they're not found suitable for parole. But we have to remember that, 2 years ago, nobody was talking about the brothers possibly getting out at some point. They were sentenced to life without parole, which in California, like most states, that really means you never get out. And here we are today, where it's a whole new world. And I've spoken with Honore Brown, the rapper X-Rated, who served 26 years in California prisons. And he got to know Erik and Lyle Menendez very well and is helping them get ready for these hearings that took place last week and the hearings that will be held. They'll be back in front of the parole board in maybe 13 months to 2 years. And here's the headline. When the Menendez brothers appear before the parole board the next time, they will be set free, and I predict that they will go home to their family.
If there have been no violations or infractions between now and then, right? There was a very clear steer. No infractions, no violations, pristine record.
From this day forward, they can have no violations, no cell phone usage, no violence, no nothing.
Yeah, and that's really what was said at the parole board hearings. And just to set it in context, you gave it a great context there, Robert, but it's also worth just for people who don't live in America, just to understand that they received a recent change in status where you mentioned they were life without parole. They were LWOP, which means no chance of freedom. But given the resentencing petition that was successful, that made Erik and Lyle both eligible for parole under the California Youthful Offender Law. So that's why it became possible for them to even go to a parole board hearing, which, as you say, I mean, this wasn't even on the books. So we have to remember, even with their prison records, everything that they've done whilst they've been incarcerated is without any hope of being released. And I think that's very important, because when you're behind closed doors and no one's watching, for me, it's about what you do in, I'm not going to say moments, because we're talking about years here. We're talking about 35 years. It's a very long time.
Decades, and that's a long time. And we learned some negative things about Erik and Lyle Menendez in the parole hearings. We found out that Erik admitted that early on, a long time ago, he was using drugs. He's been sober since 2013. We found out that both brothers were using cell phones. They had some other infractions, and I actually, who probably is the expert on the case, I never knew some of the information that came out last Thursday and Friday, but they really admitted all of the violations that they were responsible for, and they apologized to the parole board. They apologized to the prison system, and most importantly, they apologized to their family. And one of the things that DA Nathan Hochman in LA County has been talking endlessly about for many months is that Erik and Lyle Menendez are not showing enough remorse for Mr. Hochman. And that is simply not true. They have shown remorse in the media in a number of different interviews. There's a very good podcast that I recommend with the brothers appearing with Harvey Levin from TMZ and one of their attorneys, Mark Karagos. And that was released in April of 2025. And in that 45-minute podcast, you hear Erik and Lyle Menendez themselves, in their own words, talk about what happened and talk about what they hope for the future.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point there, Robert, that you raised, because I've heard them be remorseful many times. And when they've had to testify, and I'm talking about more recently, resentencing and things that they've said, not just on the podcast, but also at the parole board hearing, and I'll quote some of the things that they said, it's very clear that not a day goes by where they don't think about what they did. And as Erik said, it's a forever sentence and it's a forever crime. It's a forever crime because it's for every generation of the family, because of what they did, that it will have an impact. And he said that he just can't, there's nothing that he can do that will ever change that. And he can't be sorry enough or remorseful enough. Cannot express sorrow and remorse enough. Doing it for the rest of my life will never be enough. He said very similarly, he said that his decision to be violent was solely his and not his baby brother's responsibility. I'm profoundly sorry for who I was and for the harm everyone has endured. And then he said, I will never be able to make up for the harm and grief I caused everyone in my family. I am so sorry to everyone, and I will be forever sorry. And both of them said, well, it was clear sentiments that they are amazed that their family have stood by them, and so many of them have been showing up to support them. And that was very clear in the parole board hearings too. And perhaps before we get into that, I'd love you just to situate, you were part of an official member of the media. You were allowed the pool reports that came out from the parole board hearings, and you got them in real time. And just before you explain a bit more about that process, before we go into the detail, you mentioned statistically speaking, those inmates that go before the parole board for the very first time here in California, 86% of them are unsuccessful. So they're not found suitable. So that means only 14% are for the first time. So actually, that is very significant because it sets a tone that it was unlikely that they would be released this time round. So to your point, to the people who support the Menendez brothers and so on, I think that is in an important context here, that yes, they have infamy, right? They're the Menendez brothers. And I know Mark Geragos has a very clear view about the way that they're being treated. But when we look at the statistics, it's very unusual for someone to be released straight away. So when I said that in the Crime Analyst squad, before the parole board hearings, people were disappointed to hear that statistic. But if you flip it on its head, the parole board has a very serious undertaking to make sure whoever is released is not a risk to the public. And I've worked on the other side of that, where people have been released when they shouldn't be. And therefore, doing due diligence, I'm all about that when it comes to risk and safety and public protection. And most people are. And that's why I've looked at this case in minute detail, because I still have a very firm view around risk as a risk assessment expert. Even though I haven't been sat in the room with Erik and Lyle assessing them, I do have a clear understanding, and particularly now I've read the comprehensive reports, Erik's report, the pool reports, I should say, that you posted and you also sent to me, but also Lyle's, where it goes into really nuanced detail about their behavior behind the prison doors, but also these violations where a lot of time at the parole board hearing were spent, I would say disproportionately, on the violations. So we will talk about those violations and also the support that they've received, because you did get access to this information in real time. I know it was very grueling for you all because it was a 10-hour, 11-hour process, each day.
Right. And
Normally it would be
the
much
average,
shorter, but this wasn't. Can you just explain a
right,
bit about that, Rob?
sure. So the average parole hearing in California is actually only 3 or 4 hours long. Erik Menendez, his hearing was 10 hours last Thursday. Lyle Menendez, his hearing was 11 hours on Friday. We never took a lunch break. We just kept going and took very short breaks for bathroom breaks. But what people really need to understand about the parole hearings, one of the other headlines is if you analyze the parole hearings, as I have, I have all the pool reports that you can read on menendezmurders.com. I'm sorry, we will have them posted soon, within 48 hours on my website, menendezmurders.com. You can go to my Facebook, my Robert Rand, RAND personal Facebook right now and read all the reports from Erik's hearing, all the pool media reports from Lyle's hearing. But I understand that many people thought, this was a defeat and this was a setback for the brothers. However, the glass is half full, not half empty. And what's going on is that, as I said a moment ago, when the brothers go back in front of the parole board in 13 months to 2 years, Honore Brown, the rapper X-Rated, has told me they will be, if they have no violations, no infractions of the prison rules, they will be sent free. They will be sent home to their family. So the glass is half full here. This was actually, it was expected that they would be denied parole, and now we move on. But Erik and Lyle Menendez had two other paths to freedom. One is the habeas corpus petition, which deals with new evidence that has come out in the Menendez Menudo documentary, and also a letter that Erik wrote to his cousin Andy Cano in late 1988, complaining about the ongoing sexual abuse by his father. And so I predict that there will be evidentiary hearings sometime this fall, maybe October, maybe November, maybe December. And if those happen, which I believe they will, one of the star witnesses could be Roy Rossello, the former member of Menudo, who's the lead character in our Peacock documentary. And in the documentary, Roy only told us about one incident where he was raped by Jose Menendez. In the affidavit to the habeas, he admitted and talked about another time that he was molested at Radio City Music Hall in New York in 1985 before a Menudo concert. And now in the past 2 years, Roy has opened up quite a bit and talked to me and my reporting partner, Neri Inclan, that there were a number of incidents over a period of 3 or 4 years. So we are hoping to produce a season 2 of the Menendez Menudo documentary. Roy Rossello has filed a civil suit against Edgardo Diaz, the creator of and manager of Menudo. That is in federal court in New York. They just had the first hearing a few weeks ago. And so there are lots of moving parts to this story, and it's far from over. As I said, the habeas petition is one path to freedom. And then we still have, it's a very long shot, we still have the chance that Governor Gavin Newsom could wake up tomorrow. He could wake up a week from now and he could say, you know what? let's end this. Let's just send them home, grant them clemency, and they would walk out the next day.
Well, let's talk about those other options a little later on, because there are three. We know that also Mark Geragos is intending to challenge and appeal the parole board decision. He did say that on his podcast, that there is a route to appeal. And of course, with any parole board decision, it goes to the governor, and that's Gavin Newsom. So I think it's 120 days, isn't it, that Governor Gavin Newsom has to respond. So it's not a final decision. They've still got to wait for that. But I do think you said something interesting, which was that you learnt some new things. And given that you are somebody who's very knowledgeable about Erik and Lyle, I think it would be really helpful that the new things that we don't know about, or we didn't know before the parole board hearing, it would be great to explore them. So the parole board hearing had two commissioners. One was the parole commissioner and the other was the deputy. And in Erik's case, it was Barton and Stern. And then there was an ADA, an acting district or a deputy district attorney, I should say, Ballion, yeah, from Nathan Hochman's office, the DA's office. And Commissioner Barton set out from the top that, and I'm going to quote, "The purpose of this hearing is not to retry this case. Nor is this hearing to put your parents on trial. The purpose is to determine whether Erik Menendez poses a risk to public safety." So that's a helpful lens for people to understand the parole board hearing through. And there seemed to be, and you tell me, Rob, whether you felt the same, but with Erik, there did seem to be a large focus on the crimes themselves. And for me, it felt like that, yes, at the parole board hearing, it is right to ask questions, but it did feel like Mr. Ballion from the Deputy District Attorney was very much determined to ask questions about things like, well, why didn't Erik just leave? And why did they kill Kitty? And certain questions that we've heard DA Nathan Hochman talk about multiple times, of saying that there are false narratives. And it seemed to me that there, at times, Commissioner Barton and Commissioner Stern had to step in and tell the Deputy District Attorney that it wasn't a new trial, that it wasn't to really probe into guilt. And it seemed that they needed to keep a tight rein on some of the questioning. And I also say that just within the bounds of the family are listening to. And so to rehash, it felt at times that they were trying to rehash certain aspects of the trial or get answers to things or to put them on the spot. But all I heard in the answers were very similar things to what we've heard previously regarding bad decision making, that when in trauma and when you've got a top heavy front brain because of trauma, we know that you make bad decisions. And I think so much of this case for me is about the abuse that they experienced and endured, their impulsivity and bad decision making in fear that men who are 35, 40 years old questioning them now as if they were making these decisions now versus they were making them back when they were 17, 18 and 21. It's very bizarre to keep putting it back in that old context when we know about trauma and the impact on the brain. So, for me, there was that part to it, as well as this over focus on these violations. And with Erik, you mentioned there's some new things that we heard about, and it seemed that there was a very clear steer that Commissioner Barton said that you are not a model prisoner, and your supporters may think you're a model prisoner, but you're not. And he found that disturbing that people thought he was. But when I looked at these infractions, and when I understand that there was a violent incident in 1997, that's a very long time ago to be basing a risk assessment on in 2025, right? And I think about what I was doing in 1997 versus what I'm doing in 2024.
What we're all doing. I think it's very important for people to understand that when I interviewed Erik and Lyle Menendez in October 1989, it was 2 months after the killings, 5 months before the brothers were arrested. They were not suspects publicly. They told me how much they loved their mom and dad. Um, they were immature college kids. Today, they are 54 and 57. So they are adults, they are grown men. And also, what you mentioned, the two questions are the two questions that I'm asked most frequently by my personal friends and also by the media. Number one, why didn't they just walk out the front door? Number two, okay, maybe Jose was a monster. Some people are willing to concede that. But what about Kitty? Aren't all mothers loving and nurturing and caring? And the truth is that no, not all mothers are loving and nurturing and caring. And that's the answer number two. Very general answer. The answer to number one, why didn't they just walk out the front door? As I've learned over the years, I've interviewed all the defense therapy experts at length, including Dr. William Vickery, the forensic psychiatrist, who is the person that Erik Menendez first told a tiny bit of information to. And then over a period of a year, he opened up and felt comfortable with Dr. Vickery. And Bill Vickery told me, you can separate the people that are faking their stories from the people that are being honest with you. And the way you separate the fakers from the real people, Dr. Vickery told me, was when he comes in to interview people, the people that are faking their situation that were really not abused, they immediately want to open up and talk at length in detail from day one. With Erik Menendez, Dr. Vickery told me it was like pulling teeth to get the tiniest bit of information. You know, real abuse survivors do not want to talk about what they experienced. They're ashamed of what happened. Let's talk about Roy Rossello from Menudo. He never told anyone in his family that he had been molested when he was in Menudo. He he was just ashamed. He certainly was aware. He lives in Brazil. He certainly was aware that the Menendez case was going on. He was aware of what he experienced, but he never wanted anybody to know. With abuse survivors, some people take these secrets to their graves, and people come forward and talk when on their own schedule. There is no schedule, and Lyle Menendez's wife shut down the commentary very quickly the day after our documentary Menendez Menudo, streaming on Peacock, came out. And what she said on Lyle's public Facebook page was just what I'm saying. People come forward when they feel like it. We were actually talking to Roy Rossello for a year when we were in production on the documentary. And we suspected that he might have something to say about Jose Menendez, but he never had. It took a year until Roy was comfortable with Neri Eggplant and myself, and he told us a tiny bit of information. The same situation that Dr. Bill Vickery had with Erik. And Roy said to my reporting partner, Neri, one day, I know that guy, Jose Menendez. And, Neri's an excellent reporter. She said, what guy? And then he said, that guy, Jose Menendez, that was killed by his two sons. And Roy started with just telling us a tiny bit of information. And then over the next year and a half, he started opening up and telling us more information.
Because he wanted to know if he could trust you. And when you articulate it, it makes it much more real. We actually know through the research that many men never tell a soul. And if they do tell someone, it's in their third, fourth decade of life, normally when they have a child of their own or when they feel safe. And safe normally in a relationship, a healthy relationship. And that's normally when they're disclosed. So it's absolutely right that most abuse victims, particularly childhood ones, will not just come out and say things immediately about that abuse. And loyalty was a big issue within the family. And Jose Menendez really made it clear that there had to be loyalty and there had to be secrecy. And he threatened them with death. And I think that's another very important thing people don't realize.
Yes, I think that's very important that people realize one of the universal things that you find that happens in almost every case of children being abused by adults is that the adults threaten the child and they say, if you tell anybody, I will kill you. If you run away, I will find you. I will kill you, and that's it. And so if you're a child, just imagine just the experience of being abused, that's horrible. And then your abuser tells you that you'll be killed if you tell anybody. So it's a very difficult situation. And it's quite typical for abusers to threaten their victims.
Yeah. And, we also have to remember that when they did reach out and try and talk to someone, whether it was a cousin, whether it was an aunt, that nothing happened. And therefore, when you're a child, what you realize is that no one's coming to protect you, no one's coming to save you. And that is a very isolating thing. But also, what Erik said in reply to the question at the parole board hearing, we've got to remember he was 17, just turned 18. He was very dependent, very emotionally immature. He'd been groomed. And he also said that leaving meant death. Where would I go? He had no place to go. And he said, it's difficult to convey how terrifying my father was. And I think, again, most people just don't understand when you're a child and you're being abused, your abuser is even bigger than what you think and bigger than in real life. And if they're an authority figure who have utter control over you and they've been torturing you for a long time, and Lyle actually said when he gave his statement just how Erik was picked on all the time, was punched, choked, throttled. He was the less favored child. And so for
The
Erik,
throwaway kid.
say that again.
The throwaway kid.
Yeah, the throwaway kid, the second kid, and it was really Jose concentrating on Lyle. But trauma on his developing brain, he made impulsive and immature decisions. And he was abused as a child, so that impacts even more. But most of us, when we're 17 or 18, make not good decisions, right? Most of us. But you add in all the other factors too. And I think asking that question, it's 2025. We shouldn't be asking that of abuse survivors of why didn't you leave? Because the other key component is coercive control. And that coercive control you and I have talked about before. When you've been groomed and manipulated, you are totally paralyzed. And they were dependent. It wasn't about money. They were dependent and they loved their parents. That's the irony that all the way through listening to them and their words, they feel deep regret because they still love their parents. And most children who've been abused still adore their parents. They want their validation. They want the connection. And I heard something new from Lyle, Rob, which was him disclosing the abuse by Kitty and saying that at present day, he would call it sexual abuse. But he didn't call it sexual abuse at the time because it was connection with his mum. And he wanted that time with her. And Erik felt the same way about Jose. They wanted that deep connection. They craved it as children because they didn't get any emotional nurturing or love in any other way. That's what I've learned when I've listened to Anna Marie Baralt talk about how Jose and Kitty were to them, that these two boys were craving affection. They craved that connection. So they didn't see it as sexual abuse. They saw it
Any
as...
child craves affection. And
Exactly.
I think what you passed by one of the things I wanted to bring up, one of the key factoids of the story, the so-called spending spree of the brothers, that they went out and spent a lot of money. So here are a couple facts that are very important to understanding this story. First, the Menendez family was a very wealthy, upper class family. They spent money quite freely, the parents as well as the brothers. The brothers were nationally ranked tennis players. Jose Menendez didn't want to have to bother to give them, money all the times that they traveled. And so he gave them each a copy of his American Express card, and they were allowed to charge up to a limit of $250,000. Obviously, Jose would have been unhappy if they had charged that much. But a couple different things. First, Erik and Lyle Menendez never got their hands on any of the principal from the estate. 5 weeks after the killing of Jose and Kitty in August of 1989, their aunt, Marta Cano, a financial planner from West Palm Beach, Florida, came out to Beverly Hills and she handed each brother a check for $250,000. So, really, the brothers never had their hands on the estate. The media was reporting that the estate was worth $14 million. It was actually only worth $6 million, which is still a lot of money. But the only money that the brothers had for their so-called spending spree was this $250,000 that they received from a life insurance policy, which they never knew about. Also, Jose Menendez had told Erik and Lyle 6 months before the killings that he had disinherited them. He had taken them out of his will. So that's an important fact. And one more fact. In August of 92, about a year before the first trial started, the DA's office in LA County went before a grand jury with evidence of murder for financial gain. The grand jury did not return an indictment for murder for financial gain. And that didn't stop the prosecutors for a moment. They are still trying to, do these talking points from 30 years ago today. The DA's office knew that the public and the media, they loved that story. Greedy rich kids kill Ozzie and Harriet, this lovely couple on Sunday night in Beverly Hills. And so even though the grand jury did not return an indictment of murder for financial gain, they just kept talking about greedy rich kids. And the only story the public heard before the Menendez brothers went on trial in July of 93 was that story about greedy rich kids. And the defense made what I consider a tactical error in hindsight. They waited until 2 weeks before the first trial to go public with their defense and to start talking about the abuse. And the reaction by the public in 1993 was, well, why are we just hearing this for the first time? Why haven't we ever heard this before? But what happened in the first trial, which lasted 6 months long, there were two juries, one for each brother, because some of the evidence only applied to one or the other. And so half of the jurors at the end of the trial, half the jurors, mostly the women on the two panels, they voted for manslaughter, not murder. Now, a manslaughter conviction is still a serious conviction. The brothers would have served 22 years in state prison. And instead, the first trial ended in two mistrials. Each jury can reach a verdict. Fast forward, the second Menendez trial, the retrial, began in October of 1995, 8 days after O.J. Simpson was acquitted of murder. So the general public, and particularly LA County, was very unhappy. The DA's office here had lost the Rodney King trial, where the four LAPD officers were on trial in 1992 for beating Rodney King. They were acquitted, and that set off the LA riots in 1992. The DA's office, considered Menendez 1 to be a loss because they had two mistrials declared. And then O.J. Simpson was acquitted. So the DA's office really, really, really wanted to win one of these high-profile trials. There never should have been a retrial in the Menendez case. The only reason that there was a retrial was because Gil Garcetti, the DA at the time, was running for re-election in March of 94. The two mistrials were declared in January of 94. So the two mistrials are declared, and within a half hour, Gil Garcetti is on TV all over LA saying, we are going to retry this case. This was first-degree murder, and we are going to convict the brothers. If this had not been a high-profile case, there would have been a plea agreement. The brothers would have been sentenced to manslaughter. They would have served their 22 years and been out years ago. Instead, they have been incarcerated for 35 years and 5 months it's time to end this case. Uh, Send them home to their family. Also, in the retrial, Judge Stanley Weisberg, the trial judge, reversed most of his evidence rulings. In the first trial, the defense was allowed to put on 56 witnesses that told a very detailed story, family, teachers, coaches, friends of this family, a dysfunctional family that was spinning wildly out of control. In the second trial, the defense was only allowed to put on 25 witnesses, and those 25 witnesses were severely limited in what they could say by the trial judge, Stanley Weisberg, by his rulings. And then in what I consider the final death blow to the defense in the retrial, the judge ruled that the defense was not allowed to argue imperfect self-defense in their closing arguments. And that, so the jury in the second trial, I don't blame them. They voted, based on the evidence that they had, but they didn't have all the evidence. And so Erik and Lyle Menendez were convicted in March of '96 to first-degree murder. The jury only had the choice of murder or acquittal. They certainly weren't going to acquit the brothers, so they voted for murder. And then we had what's called a penalty phase after the guilt phase of the second trial. And in that penalty phase, the jury did hear all these relatives, all these teachers, coaches, family, friends. And several of the jurors told me after the trial ended, if they had heard that evidence from the retrial in the guilt phase of the trial, they wouldn't have voted for murder. So that's the problem. The second trial was a complete miscarriage of justice. And here we are, many years, many months later, still trying to resolve this case. And as I just said, it's time to end this case. It's time to send Erik and Lyle Menendez home to their family.
It's been a very long time and a very long journey. And thank you for going back through some of that history for some who may not know it. And I will say, do listen to Crime Analyst. I've got a whole series on the case when I first started looking at it over 2 years ago. And I have to say, I was very shocked by what I found, particularly around trial 2. And it's worth pointing out that Judge Stanley Weisberg was also the judge on the Rodney King case. So
yes.
That for me was a big problem. Yeah, all these connections behind the scenes, and it seemed like they were absolutely determined. And for me, this is about having a fair shake, right? Justice is meant to be transparent. People are meant to get a fair shake. And I don't believe that Lyle or Erik got a fair shake because their personalities were looked at. Lyle was very much characterized as this cold, calculated, strategic person. Narcissism and these sorts of words coming up. But what we hear from Father DC, who's known Erik and Lyle for a very long time and actually wrote to Judge Stanley Weisberg, is that's not the impression that he has formed of Erik or Lyle, and he's been working with them and helping them change and grow throughout their life course. Actually, before they killed their parents, he knew them. But he said that Lyle really struggled when he first met him because his view was very much Jose's view, which is might makes right, which is all about power over. He was taught things like power and taking trophies and cheating, and victories determine your worth and not love and care, and that weaknesses, everything when you're not winning is a weakness. And so Lyle did not open up or talk, first of all, when he was seeing Father DC. But Father DC said that he's grown incredibly in terms of his soul, his energy, his spiritual awakening, his ability, his empathy, his care for people. And he said, present day at the Parole Board hearing, growth is not possible in prison, but Lyle has grown in this impossible environment, that Lyle actually enjoyed being in prison to begin with because it meant he had real relationships. And I find that staggering, Robert. That to me is such an important piece of testimony that
the Menendez brothers. The Menendez brothers are not cartoon characters to me to Father Candizi, to their family, to people that know them. They are not the people you saw portrayed on Saturday Night Live or on sketches on the Tonight Show with Jay Leno. These are real flesh and blood people. You know, they have gone through some horrible experiences. They have grown from those experiences. And I just want to give a shout out to you, Laura, and all the episodes that you've devoted to this story. I highly recommend that people read my book, The Menendez Murders. I highly recommend that people watch the Peacock documentary, Menendez Menudo, Boys Betrayed. And I highly recommend that you go back and listen to the episodes that Laura had on the podcast about Menendez Menudo and about the case in general, because once you learn the facts of this story, you might have a very different view of the story as opposed to what you might see in some of the media.
Yes, well, you definitely will have a different view. And if you're interested in the actual facts rather than things being sensationalized, I can't tell you how many people I've had to correct for saying they blew their parents' heads off, mimicking what
Well, we saw that in Monsters.
said. Yeah, and we've seen it
So
in the Netflix
people,
show
you know,
too.
there was
But I
a
think
scene.
it's
There was a scene in Monsters Menendez, a scripted series produced by Ryan Murphy for Netflix, and one of the most shocking scenes was that showing the Menendez brothers naked in a shower, making out and naked. And I guarantee you that scene never happened in real life. And
so
yet, there
egregious.
we
That
have it
scene
in
was
a
so
TV
egregious.
series that goes out to 300 million subscribers of Netflix, and people don't aren't always sure about the difference between a scripted TV series and a documentary, which generally documentaries stick to the facts. And so that's just one of the many things swirling around this case. And I'm grateful to Ryan Murphy. I'm going to send him a bouquet of dead flowers for boosting my book sales and also raising the awareness about the case. I'm grateful to Netflix and Campfire Studios, which produced the Menendez documentary, which is interesting. I'm interviewed in it. That came out in October of 2024. But I've said this before, after 35 years and 5 months, what gets you out of prison is hard evidence, not a bussy TV show.
Yes, and hard evidence, I think, is very clear, even though there is, there was a concentration on these violations. And I just want to go back to 3 or 4 points before we end, because there was so much for me in the parole board hearings that's new. The violations I already talked about for Erik, the violence in 1997 and 2011, and drugs, and he's been clean since 2013. So again, the difference from 2013 to now. Misuse of a computer, touching his wife on a visit, and then the cell phone infractions. And given the cell
And
phone infractions, he
I
lost the visits, right? The family
yes.
visits. So they took that
Let me
seriously.
just briefly explain the cell phone usage and why that's a problem in prisons. Um, I mean, the general public probably thinks, why are they spending so much time talking about cell phones? Um, Erik Menendez, in his hearing, they spent a lot of time asking him questions about the crime. And by the way, there were two separate commissioners on each day of the hearings. So separate commissioners for Erik, separate commissioners for Lyle. When during Lyle's hearing, they only maybe spent briefly 20 minutes asking about the crime. They spent over an hour and a half pounding him with questions about cell phones. Here's the reason that cell phones are an issue in prison. If you have a burner cell phone, hypothetically, you could, if you were in a gang, you could order a gang hit. Hypothetically, you could order drugs from someone outside the prison. And so that's why the cell phone use is so. Normally, the prisoners are only allowed to make their phone calls over phone lines that are monitored by the prison officials. And so if you're using a burner cell phone, obviously those calls aren't monitored. And so that's the problem. And one other thing that I forget which brother said it, but one of the brothers said they paid $1,000 to buy a cell phone. And how do you think those cell phones are getting inside the prison? Guess what? It's the guard and the staff that are responsible for smuggling some of the cell phones, the various ways. But if we have guards that are selling cell phones to prisoners or guards that are selling drugs to prisoners, then that's a major problem because there's corruption within the prison staff, hypothetically.
Yeah, I mean, it's rule breaking and it's violations, but does it equate to risk of violence? And now I'm saying this as an expert on risk assessment. They're two very different things, but they do have a point that at the time when they're going through resentencing and so on is not the time to be breaking any rules, full stop, right? So for Lyle doing the cell phone infraction in 2024 and again in 2025, I have to say that was very poor decision making on his behalf, no matter what the reason. And he apologized, but the same thing, you don't give them any reason to refuse, right? If when you know that you're going up for resentencing, you know you're under the microscope. And he did apologize for that. And he did say he didn't think that it was causing harm. And in real terms, maybe he hadn't thought about the fact that the same phone he's using, another inmate might be using to organize a hit, right? You don't know.
Do some kind of nefarious activity. And former DA George Castone announced the resentencing initiative for the Menendez brothers in late October 2024. And so you might think that they would just be on their perfect behavior while that resentencing procedure process was taking place. And unfortunately, both Erik and Lyle, they were both busted with cell phones in November 2024. So within a month after the resentencing process began, both brothers were busted for cell phone violations. And as I said earlier in the program, I predict that both Erik and Lyle will have pristine records, no violations, no cell phone usage, no violence between today and when the brothers appear before the parole board 13 months to 2 years from now. And if they come back before board and they have no violations, I predict they will be set free and they go home to their family.
Yes, and I hope so too. And I will just throw a couple of other things out there before we close. And one is that prisons are not the best environment to rehabilitate anyway. And so, someone who's been in prison for 35 years, you would expect to see some infractions and violations. But what was extraordinary for me was Lyle's non-violent history and the fact that he was put in a high power unit to begin with, which is an ultra high security unit, level 4, because he refused to fight back. And him choosing a non-violent way for 35 years speaks volumes. And I do just want to point that out, that when we're doing a risk assessment to look at risk of violence to the public, which is what this should be about, for me,
sure. One of the things that I say frequently, a very simple message: the streets of California are not safer tonight because Erik and Lyle Menendez are locked up. There are people that commit terrible crimes against strangers, and they're out of prison in 15 or 20 years. Erik and Lyle Menendez have been incarcerated for 35 years and 5 months. Let's stop this insanity.
Yeah, and that's an important point when we talk about risk assessment, which is why I bring it up. Using phones versus risk of violence, being put in a unit for your own protection because you don't fight back, and other inmates are saying he's at risk because he doesn't fight back, and a father is saying that he is non-violent. Everybody's saying he's never fought back. He's the person that you go to as officers to resolve conflict. That speaks volumes about character, although I do think it's daft that he used the cell phone. So I'll leave that part there. With Erik, it was interesting. I mean, with Erik and Lyle, they talked about the burglaries before the killings. And I just want to say this about the burglaries, because now I've heard it in Erik's words or seen it written, and also Lyle's, of why commit the burglaries, right? This was always an issue for me, particularly when they've got this line of credit to a bank account and to a credit card. This for me is about resistance and trauma. And I finally saw those words on a page from Erik explaining that the first one was about a prank, the second one was about resistance to his father. And that part of trauma, that when horrible things are happening to you, sometimes again you make terrible, terrible decisions that don't make sense to anybody else. But it wasn't about money, it was about the thrill of doing it. And what they both said about it was that they didn't fear, Jose Menendez was not going to be angry with them for doing the burglary. They both said that he would be angry with them for getting caught. Now that talks about the lack of moral foundation, that these boys were raised with no moral foundation at all.
Jose Menendez had a motto for his family, for his sons, and that was lie, cheat, steal, and win. And Jose Menendez was not upset about the burglaries. He was upset they got caught. And one other key fact you need to know, there were a number of other friends of the brothers who were involved in these burglaries, and the victims of the burglaries were the parents of other friends of the brothers. And so this was not, two criminals really masterminding some great caper. This was, immature high school kids doing, stupid stuff. And
it was reckless and impulsive that they didn't need to do. Now, that is what you have to ask the question about, right, Robert? The same as when they killed their parents, the question's why. It was never about did they do it? It was about the why. And I feel like with the parole board hearing, we've got much closer to that. Even when asked about the spending spree, which you mentioned, for the first time I heard, Lyle in words, written words that I saw in your pool report, was that he talked about the fact that they went on a spending spree because it made them feel better, because they felt no relief. They didn't feel good after the murders. They were asked about that. They felt shock and horror and remorse and disgust. And they went and bought things. I think Lyle said it was to the tune of $100,000 because it made them feel better. Retail therapy. It wasn't about just being flash with cash. It was about this horrible thing that they'd done. They thought the police would arrest them. That didn't happen. There's no script for, well, then what do you do? These aren't criminally sophisticated, boys or criminals who've done this many, many times that people think, oh, they got a kick from it and then they went on this spending spree. Sure. Totally different. And hearing that from Lyle, that, again, it was a stupid decision, but at the time it made them feel good. I think that's another important point.
And one of the things I like to share with people is if you handed any 18 or 21-year-old kid $250,000 in cash, to me, the surprise would be if they didn't go out and buy a nice car or buy some nice clothes. So, the spending spree was never that important to me because I not only knew the background of this family, upper class family, that spent quite a bit of money, Jose and Kitty, as well as the brothers, long before the killings. And then once again, if you hand an 18-year-old kid or a 21-year-old kid $250,000 of cash, what do you think they're going to do?
Yeah. Rather than it being part of the narrative about premeditation and this was about the money. And that's why it destroys the narrative that DA Hochman and the prosecutors put forth, because again, this premeditation, they bought the guns, they wanted the guns the week before they were to kill. Well, again, both Erik and Lyle said separately it was for protection. It was for protection. They did have the belief at the time their parents were going to kill them. They believed that at the time. They don't believe it now. Now, that's a big difference of saying that when you're in fear at the time, when that person who's abused you is larger than life, when you're hypervigilant, which is what Lyle said, you're reading all the signs wrong, you don't feel you've got anywhere to go, and things went horribly wrong. And when Ballion, Deputy District Attorney Ballion, kept hounding Erik about why kill your mum, look, it was violent, it was brutal, it was horrific what they did. But when you put yourself, if you possibly can, into Erik's shoes and think that he had just found out his mother had betrayed him and she had never protected him, not once, and you believe your father's going to kill you, you know that she is not going to step in. You know she's not going to protect you. And he said he felt anger, pure anger in those moments. I can understand why he felt that way. And I'm not interested in Balian or anybody else who's 45, 55-year-old man who's not in that situation as a child or a 17-year-old. I'm not interested in their perspective in the cold light of day. I'm interested in when we go back into a child or a teenager's shoes when they're being abused and they make bad decisions. I'm interested in the why of that. So yes, it was brutal, but she never intervened. No one was coming to protect either Lyle or Erik, and they took matters into their own hands in those moments. And I can understand that decision making. I'm not saying it's right, but that betrayal, that betrayal trauma is so significant. And we can't think about it in the cold light of day. We have to think about it in the context of what they were going through. And Kitty was very cruel to them. What they now both understand, and this is the new thing that I read, was that they had a different understanding of their mum's childhood, of her levels of abuse, of her fear of Jose, of her being fearful he was going to leave her, all the things that they didn't necessarily know as teenage boys, right? And as a 17, 18-year-old, as a 21-year-old who's, you know, not really emotionally engaged, and most teenage boys aren't, as we know, but when you've been abused, your level of maturity, or immaturity, I should say, you know, why would they know all of this about their mum? They're just reacting in those moments, but now they have a deeper understanding and they regret it. And I think, Robert, that's such a powerful thing of hearing this regret and this remorse, that when Balian, the deputy district attorney, sort of summed up with Erik, he basically said that Erik was a risk and a danger. Erik was calculated. Erik never accepts responsibility. And I'm going to quote him, he's not reformed. He's still an unreasonable risk to society. He has no insights into his crimes. That's not what I read.
Not true. It's simply not true. The brothers are very different people now than they were then. And you can't get around the elephant in the room. Erik and Lyle Menendez brutally killed their parents. They are not celebrities. You know, they're notorious people that are well known because of a crime they were involved in. But the most important thing that your listeners and watchers need to know is that they are very different men today than the men I met when they were 18 and 21. And once again, if you want to learn the facts of the case, read my book, listen to the other episodes Crime Analyst and Laura have done, and you'll be surprised.
Absolutely. And there will be another episode in the Crime Analyst squad where Robert and I are going to talk at a deeper level about some of the behind the scenes things. So you can join us over there on Patreon, which is patreon.com/crime analyst, where Robert and I will be continuing our conversation. So I just want to thank you, Robert, for your incredible work, your incredible reporting, you know, keeping hold of all these facts and laying it out and making it sure that false narratives are challenged. Really, really important. So I thank you for your time speaking to me too.
Of course.
And to my listeners and all of you here, I want to end with my normal mantra, which is be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instincts.